the situation in the Middle East. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the distinguished representative of the Syrian Arab Republic to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite Mr. Staffan de Mistura, Special Envoy of the Secretary-General for Syria, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. Mr. de Mistura is joining via video teleconference from Beirut. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. It is a privilege for me now to give the floor to Mr. Staffan de Mistura.
Querido señor presidente, le agradezco mucho.
President, thank you very much for this opportunity from Beirut.
I will take this opportunity to update you and the members of the Council since my last briefing, which took place last week in New York. Today, I will focus particularly on an update after my consultations in Damascus 2 days ago. Following the Secretary General's meeting with Syria Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs Moallem during the General Assembly, I met Minister Moallem in Damascus on the 24th of October. We focused on the political process and the efforts to convene a constitutional committee. I appreciated the quite frank, nature of the exchanges that we had in Damascus. Minister Moallem expressed appreciation for his meeting with the Secretary General during the General Assembly. He indicated that this has paved the way for the meeting in Damascus. I will now refer as accurate as possible to what I heard from Minister Moallem. He strongly underlined the principles of sovereignty and non-interference in internal affairs of UN member states. He underlined that the Syrian constitution is a highly sensitive matter of national sovereignty. On the Sochi final statement, Minister Moallem referred to another outcome rather than the one circulated by the Russian Federation to this Council. He said that it was possible for the government of Syria to take some elements of the outcome circulated by Russia and, quote-unquote, reconcile them with the government-preferred other outcome. And the key differences in this regard concerned mainly the role of the UN. As regards the understanding reached between Russia and the United Nations before the Sochi event, which I mentioned specifically when I briefed you on the 17th of October, Minister Moallem did not view it as consistent with the principles of sovereignty and non-interference. Basically, Minister Moallem did not accept a role for the UN in general in identifying or selecting the middle third list. Rather, Minister Moallem indicated that the government of Syria and Russia had agreed recently that the three Astana guarantors and the Syrian government would, in consultation among them, prepare a proposal as regards the third Middle East and present it to the UN facilitation. I should add, just for the sake of completeness, that Minister Moallem did not, in this occasion and in this meeting, indicate the government's views on the mandate, chairmanship, decision-making, or any other aspects of the rules of procedure necessary for a constitutional committee to function. Signor Presidente, for my part, I welcome the chance for the UN to talk directly with the government on the constitutional committee. I also regretted that this had not been possible since the Sochi meeting, as the government had declined the UN offers to engage it directly on the Constitutional Committee and its follow-up. I recalled that it was in this context of non-engagement by the government with the UN that the UN began to work with the Astana guarantors at their own suggestion on a package, and that Russia and Iran had informed the UN that they'd been constantly consulting the government as the consultations proceeded. I indicated that it was also appropriate and logical for the UN, as the mediator mandated by the Security Council, to seek understandings with Russia regarding a meeting that Russia had proposed in Sochi, hosted and facilitated, in order to ensure a common understanding of how the initiative would contribute to the UN-mandated process. I reminded Minister Moallem of the convening role of the UN, mandated by the Security Council Resolution 2254. I also recalled the terms of the Sochi final statement as circulated by the Russian Federation to this Council. And, if you allow me, I remind you also today what it was indeed agreed, and I quote: 1. To form a constitutional committee comprising the government of Syrian Arab Republic delegation, along with wide represented opposition delegation, for drafting of a constitutional reform as a contribution to the political settlement under the UN auspices in accordance with the Security Council Resolution 2254. Second point, the Constitutional Committee would, at the very least, comprise government, opposition, civil representatives in the intra-Syrian talks, Syrian experts, civil society, independents, tribal leaders, and indeed women. Care would be taken to ensure adequate representation of the Syrian ethnic and religious components. Final agreement is to be reached in the UN-led Geneva process on the mandate and terms of reference, powers, rules of procedure, and selection criteria for the composition of the Constitutional Committee. End of quote. I've explained in detail during the last briefing to all of you the criteria that guide us in approaching the question on the list, and I went through this with Minister Moallem. Most importantly, I stressed that the UN was in Damascus precisely to consult the government on the list. As the facilitator, I offered for the UN to work there and then with the government if the government objected to particular names, or even on development of a new, credible, balanced and inclusive list, as long as it had those characteristics. I observed that this seemed to me to be fully respecting the sovereignty of the Syrian Arab Republic. Indeed, it was an invitation to exercise that sovereignty. At a certain point, Minister Moallem proposed that I do withdraw the proposed middle, third list, already on the table. I indicated that the UN could withdraw its proposal only once and only if there was an agreement on a new, credible, balanced and inclusive list consistent with Security Council Resolution 2254 and the Sochi final statement. I urged that we should seize the opportunity to ascertain if that was possible or not. Minister Moallem indicated that he would get back to me if new instructions came from his own leadership. However, he also said he preferred at this stage to await the outcome of my own forthcoming consultations with the Astana guarantors. I should add that Minister Moallem stated that the Astana guarantors had rejected the initial UN proposal on a third list. I, for my part, indicated this was not really the case, and that while they had suggested the need for some changes, They were engaging on the proposal, and it has already been revised more than once. I also indicated that all three guarantors supported the UN's role as per Security Council Resolution 2254 and the Sochi Declaration. Mr. President, the government has expressed its position clearly and indeed indicated, and I can say so, that it wished it to be known publicly, which I'm doing at the moment. I cannot at this stage report, however, any evolution on his own position beyond what I just told you and I heard myself, and I'm reporting to you faithfully. The efforts of those who convened and sponsored Sochi to ensure that the government of Syria would be fully on board with the outcomes of the final declaration of Sochi have not, as of today, produced, therefore, the outcome we were hoping for. Otherwise, we would have heard something different. Taking into account, one, the mandate of the Special Envoy embodied in the Security Council Resolution 2254. Two, Minister Moallem's different understanding of the role of the UN and of the Sochi final declaration. Three, the extent of the government's desire to reopen the work today. Well, we do have a serious challenge, let's be frank. It is my intention to spare no efforts to address this challenge during the forthcoming weeks. Since Minister Moallem indicated that the government preferred methodology at this stage was to working with the Astana guarantors on a third list, a lot of responsibility and expectation rests now on them and on how to implement the Sochi Declaration in a manner that carries forward the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2254 and gives practical effect to the basic points on which the UN supported to Sochi. As I've already indicated, the UN proposal was made after careful consultations, including with the guarantors, and has been revised already in light of those consultations. The very difficulties of keeping everyone on board should be a reminder to all to be careful in thinking that some radically different approach has any prospects of success. The UN is not opposed to constructive and moderate suggestions so long as we maintain the same spirit of credibility, I repeat, credibility, balance, international legitimacy of the middle third list on the table. And we have a sense of urgency to find common ground or at least clarify where we stand. Because we should not miss the opportunity of the Idlib window. That's why November is becoming so important. Let me also stress once more, the UN believes it is important to ensure a minimum 30% women in the committee, and that this requires at least 24 out of the 50 in the middle third to be women. Tomorrow, I will be traveling to Istanbul to brief the presidents of France, Germany, Russia, and Turkey. When they meet to discuss Syria, I'm honored by this invitation. I will use that occasion to remind these four important leaders that given that a catastrophe in Idlib has so far been avoided, given the international consensus to see a credible and balanced constitutional committee under the UN facilitation as soon as possible, and given Secretary General's instructions to me, who I am constantly consulting on this occasion even more than ever, the instructions that I should be exhausting every avenue in the time that remains of my mandate, there is, in my opinion, still a clear window of opportunity that needs to be urgently seized. The influence that can be exercised by all world leaders, including very much the four world leaders who are meeting tomorrow in Istanbul, can be crucial in ensuring that this happens. Since on Monday, members of the small group will meet in London, I will use also that occasion to host a meeting later on with them with the context of the Geneva process. And I really look forward to hosting the Astana guarantors very soon. They themselves met in recent days and, according to their statement, discussed many aspects of a constitutional committee. That meeting will be vitally important consultation. I will spare no efforts in the time that remains of my mandate to verify whether it is indeed possible to convene a UN-facilitated, Syrian-owned, Syrian-led constitutional committee that is credible, balanced and inclusive, and contributes in the context of the Geneva process to implementing Security Council Resolution 2254. If it is, the UN will convene as soon as possible such a committee. I will, in any case, share a full assessment as Special Envoy when I brief yourself, the Security Council, in person on the 19th of November. Meanwhile, we shall keep our door open. We shall keep under view all options for a constructive and credible outcome. Señor Presidente, le agradezco mucho este.
President, I thank you very much. This is my briefing to date.
Doy las gracias a...
On behalf of the Council, I should like to thank Mr. de Mistura for the information, and I now give the floor to those members of the Council who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Special Envoy de Mistura, for your briefing. The United States, along with all other members of the small group, Egypt, France, Germany, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and the United Kingdom, and other like-minded UN Security Council partners are united in our position that the UN should move swiftly to convene the Constitutional Committee. We continue to strongly support Special Envoy de Mistura's efforts toward the formation of that committee in November. As the Special Envoy noted, the Constitutional Committee must be credible, balanced, and representative of the Syrian people. And we note, despite what the Special Envoy heard in Damascus, the United Nations has exclusive control over the committee's membership, schedule, and scope of work, as affirmed by the Russian Federation in its January 2018 Sochi Declaration. Mr. President, further obstruction of the committee's formation is unacceptable. Further delay risks squandering the window of opportunity provided by the Turkish and Russian demilitarized zone that succeeded in preventing further bloodshed in Idlib and beyond. Parties have been consulted. No one should doubt that the UN Special Envoy has the mandate to move forward to establish the Constitutional Committee. Any list proposed by anyone must have the approval of the Special Envoy, not just in its membership, but in how it is compiled. That is his charge, and not just from Sochi, but from paragraph 2 of UN Security Council Resolution 2254. And we should be in full agreement that there is no alternative to a UN political process as described in that resolution and agreed by unanimous decision of this Council. That political process must move forward now. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United States for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of France.
Mr. President, first of all, I would like to thank the Special Envoy of the United Nations Secretary General for his particularly important and enlightening briefing concerning progress in the political process and more broadly concerning, I'd like to thank him for his tireless efforts, which deserve and enjoy our full support. We requested this session, echoing the proposal made by Stefan de Mistura last week. We did so because Syria is currently at a crossroads. It can either tip into a military escalation in Idlib, which would open up one of the darkest chapters in the Syrian tragedy, or it could take the difficult path of genuine political momentum for a settlement to the conflict. And we are profoundly convinced that today, perhaps for the first time in 7 years, there is a narrow window of opportunity to achieve that. Either scenario, both the encouraging one and the discouraging one, are both possible, and the choice depends a great deal on us, on the ability of this Council to come together around the option of peace. The creation of the Constitutional Committee can and must be the turning point that we are looking for. The first step in a genuine political movement, the establishment of this committee as quickly as possible, is therefore today our priority. To be clear, between war and peace in Syria, the key is largely in the country of Tolstoy. The establishment of the Constitutional Committee essentially presupposes Russia using its full weight in Damascus to achieve this, just as we are doing for our part with our partners in the small group. After all, the idea of the Constitutional Committee came out of an initiative from Russian diplomacy, and today all of the members of this council, without exception, have advocated for the establishment of the committee. So, what are we waiting for to move forward? I would therefore today like to express 3 messages, clearly identifying the responsibility of the Syrian regime because their obstruction is continuing to block the launch of the political process, sharing with this Council our efforts, the efforts conducted by France and the small group to achieve this, and lastly, to voice the possible subsequent solutions. Dear Stefan, you went to Damascus to hear the expectations and positions of one of the parties to the conflict. From the picture that you have just painted, it seems, as was unfortunately predictable, that the regime does not consider itself bound by a commitment, even though a few months ago it transmitted its list to the special envoy, and it rejects the list of the third of the Constitutional Committee proposed by the special envoy, not hesitating in doing so to trample the rules established in Sochi. The conclusions of your visit are something that provides clarification concerning the responsibilities at play, and require us to redouble our efforts to get the political process off the ground. The UN has made considerable efforts to achieve a composition of the Constitutional Committee which represents all components of Syrian society. And here once again, on behalf of France, I would like to pay tribute to Staffan de Mistura for his work. Dear Stefan, you have conducted in-depth consultations, adjusting your proposals several times so as to achieve a balanced, universally acceptable composition of the Constitutional Committee. The offer currently on the table responds to those requirements. You were mandated to conduct this work and to achieve the establishment of the Constitutional Committee, and you have our full support for inviting the participants without delay to a first meeting in November, and we firmly invite you to move forward. Mr. President, France has spared no effort to encourage progress in the political process. The ministers from the small group have published a joint communiqué on the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly to call for the immediate creation of the Constitutional Committee. The members of the small group, who all spoke last week in the Security Council, demonstrated their unity in support for this agenda, along with the vast majority of members of this council. President Macron spoke on the telephone with President Trump at the beginning of the week on the subject of Syria, and the urgent need to make progress on the political path was raised. Our determination to achieve the creation of the Constitutional Committee is therefore very clear. The Istanbul summit, which will take place on Saturday and will bring together France, Germany, Russia and Turkey, must also allow for progress to be made on this specific point and, of course, on the subsequent political process. The small group will meet once again before the end of the month. There is, therefore, unprecedented mobilization for the committee to meet. So let's come together to drive with all of our strength in this direction so that we do not allow this very fragile window of opportunity to close. Mr. President, what do we need to do now? As confirmed by the Special Envoy's visit to Damascus, the top priority is for everyone to at last bring the necessary pressure to bear on Damascus for the committee to be able to meet in November. This is the only possible path. Together, we must show that we are firm and mobilized to implement the objectives that we clearly endorsed. The convergence of the Council around a proposal initially made by Russia is a unique opportunity, and not seizing that opportunity would be irresponsible. We cannot allow the regime to ruin our collective efforts, without which the conflict would continue for many more years, without financial resources to rebuild the country, and without refugees being able to return. In sum, dear Stefan, your roadmap is clear and in accordance with Resolution 2254, which more than ever is our common compass, and you have our full support for implementing it. And I will conclude by making a solemn appeal to everyone's sense of responsibility. We should be all fully aware of the risk of a new escalation in the Syrian tragedy. This has not been ruled out. It will not be ruled out once and for all unless a credible and inclusive political solution is found. This is to say that the coming weeks are crucial, and that is why we will not hesitate to bring the Security Council together, to convene the Security Council as often as necessary during this period to mobilize the international community in support of United Nations mediation, and at last to achieve the long-delayed creation of the Constitutional Committee. The establishment of the Constitutional Committee, I remind you, will only be the first step in a long process that needs to bring peace to Syria through elections and the establishment of a safe and neutral environment on the ground. Dear Stefan, we are counting on you, just as, up until the last, you will be able to count on our full support. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of France for his statement. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Thank you to Stefan and his team for briefing us today. Mr. President, I find it incredible that we should have to rehearse, for the benefit of the Syrian authorities, why the UN needs to be involved in Syria. It isn't a matter of national sovereignty that there are over 1 million refugees. It isn't a matter of national sovereignty that there are 400,000 dead in Syria. This is a threat to international peace and security. It is right that the UN is involved. The UN has been involved on the humanitarian side, it's involved on the refugee side, it's involved in the health side. It is absolutely front and centre right that it should be involved in the political process. So I will go further than you, Stefan. You talked about a serious challenge. I think we've actually faced a grave challenge. We face a grave challenge to the way members of the United Nations cooperate with the United Nations. And as my American and French colleagues have said, we face a grave challenge in terms of the situation on the ground. And there's now, additionally, enormous doubt over what Sochi was and what it now represents. Either Russia has given the UN and this Council assurances it has proved too weak to deliver on, or it was all a cynical smokescreen designed to divert attention and energy while Russia, Syria and Iran prosecuted the military campaign. And that military campaign has been brought to a halt only by the international outrage at the threat to 3 million civilians in Idlib, and then the Turks bravely stepped in and brokered an agreement designed to protect those civilians. So I think we need 5 things, and in support of what my French and American colleagues have said. We need clarity on the status of the Sochi agreement and these new proposals from the Syrian authorities. What do they mean? What does Russia, what do Iran think about them? We need clarity on what steps need to be taken by all the players before 19 November, when, Stefan, you've offered to come back and brief the Council, and before the end of November, when you step down. We need clarity that Russia, as a P5 member, an Astana guarantor, and the Sochi convener, along with Syria and Iran, will work constructively and tirelessly with the UN. All UN members have a responsibility to support you, Stefan, as the Secretary-General's Special Envoy. We need to hear today that that promise of constructive, tireless, dedicated engagement to bring this conflict to an end is there. We need the agreement on Idlib to hold. We need that opportunity that others have mentioned to be seized. We need the Constitutional Committee to be convened, and I share the views of my American and French colleagues on that. We need humanitarian access to be improved, and we need 2254 to be upheld. The Council needs to come together to support the political process. Without the political process, this dreadful conflict will never truly end, whatever happens militarily on the ground. We look forward to further reports after the international meetings in the coming days. But I do believe, Mr. President, that we must hear today from all Council members that they will support the UN as it tries its very best to move the political process forward. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom for her statement, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Sweden.
Mr. President, and thank you very much to the Special Envoy for the briefing this morning. Staffan, we commend your intensified efforts towards reaching a political solution and bringing an end to the conflict in Syria. We very much appreciate your update today after your visit to Damascus, although I have to say that the contents of what you report back on the response from Damascus is not what we had hoped. We are deeply disappointed by the continued lack of cooperation by the Syrian government regarding the Constitutional Committee, which contradicts the Sochi final statement circulated by Russia to this Council. We support your approach, Staffan, and your insistence on credibility, balance, and international legitimacy. And therefore we call on the Syrian government, again, to fully cooperate with the UN, and that those with close relations with Damascus, especially Russia, to support such efforts. Mr. President, we fully support Staffan's and his mandate to establish the Constitutional Committee, constituting the first step towards a political solution in line with Security Council 2254. The final statement of Sochi made clear that it was via the Geneva process and the facilitation of the UN Special Envoy that the final selection of the committee would be made. So the Special Envoy's intensified efforts in many ways constitute a make it or break it for the UN's efforts to convene a credible constitutional committee, and with that, the legitimacy that comes with it. So Staffan needs and deserves the wholehearted backing of this Council, because it's only through a UN-led process that we can achieve a political solution acceptable to all Syrians and the international community. So, at this critical time, we want to reiterate a strong call for the Syrian government that I believe everyone in this Council agrees on, to fully engage and support the UN-led political process and make sure that there will be real progress in time for the next meeting in November, as previous speakers have said. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Sweden for his statement, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of China.
Thank you, Mr. President. First of all, I wish to thank Special Envoy de Mistura for his briefing and appreciate his efforts to facilitate a political settlement of the Syrian issue. Thanks to the efforts of the Syrian people themselves and with the support of the international community, the situation in Syria remains, in general, stable. And the political settlement process has maintained its momentum. Syrian government has invited de Mistura, the Special Envoy, to visit Damascus to have in-depth exchange of views on facilitating the political process in Syria, including the formation of the Constitutional Committee. The Russian Federation, Turkey, and Iran met in Moscow and jointly sent out a positive message in support of the facilitation of the Syrian political process. And we appreciate the efforts of all the parties. Mr. President, China has all along been supporting a political solution to the Syrian issue. The international community should push for the revitalization of the Syrian-owned and Syrian-led political process in which Syria's sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity must be respected. Mr. President, the Syrian conflict has been going on for more than 7 years. Resolving differences requires all parties to work together and meet each other halfway. The formation of the Constitutional Committee must be conducted in a steady and orderly manner, striking a balance between the legitimate concerns of the Syrian government and those of the other parties, making it representative and acceptable to all, to ensure that the Syrian political process is sustainable and fruitful. The future of Syria will be ultimately determined by the Syrian people themselves. The international community should continue its support for the good offices of the United Nations and its Special Envoy de Mistura, properly leverage the role of the Astana process, and help keep the Syrian parties fully engaged in dialogue and consultation, thereby facilitating efforts of the Syrian parties to gradually achieve reconciliation, resolve differences, and find a realistic, durable political solution. We hope that all the parties concerned will jointly ensure the effective functionality of the demilitarized zone of Idlib and consolidate the gains in the fight against terrorism, assist in the clearance of explosive remnants of war, rebuild infrastructure, and ensure the return of refugees and IDPs as early as possible. Mr. President, China stands ready to work with the international community in a joint effort to facilitate the political settlement in Syria and improve the humanitarian situation and to play a constructive role in the restoration of peace and stability in Syria and the region. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of China for his statement, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Kingdom of the Netherlands.
Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Stefan, for your briefing. Frankly speaking, we're disappointed. We were hoping for more positive information, and we're concerned about the challenges you described, especially the attitude of the Syrian regime as to the role of the UN. In our view, it is time for the Constitutional Committee to be launched. In our view, it's important to make irreversible progress towards a political resolution of the conflict in Syria by convening the Constitutional Committee under UN auspices as soon as possible in November, before the end of the tenure of Special Envoy Staffan de Mistura. We need to see the actual launch of the Constitutional Committee, and the invitation should be sent out in the coming weeks. One can only speak of a credible political process when the Constitutional Committee itself is credible, balanced, inclusive, and represents all Syrians. Therefore, the role of the UN is key. Therefore, this Council adopted Resolution 2254. The role and the autonomy of the UN is essential, and this autonomous role includes the membership, the scheduling, and the scope of work. The UN has not started from scratch, but is operating fully in line with Resolution 2254 and the Sochi final statement of January 2018, circulated to this Council by Russian Federation. So the Syrian regime has to work with the UN, and we count on countries who have influence, especially the Russian Federation, to use its influence with Damascus. We need to see meaningful commitment of the Syrian regime with the UN. The political time and space for further delaying the process and endlessly moving goalposts simply is up. We expect the Syrian regime to make sure that the Syrian delegation can travel to participate, that it can participate in full, and that it will participate in good faith, contrary to what we have seen in earlier Geneva rounds. And we expect the same for any members of the UN's middle list that currently reside in Syria. And let me also say that we strongly support the Special Envoy's commitment for women to constitute 30% of the Constitutional Committee's members, as you just indicated. And we strongly urge that this commitment be extended to ensure that any future drafting subcommittee or other committees will also include 30% women's representation, especially in this week dedicated to 1325 and women, peace and security. And of course, the Constitutional Committee is not a goal in itself. It is part of the broader UN-led political process based on the Geneva Communiqué and on Security Council Resolution 2254. Implementation of that Security Council resolution is the only path forward, and there's no circumventing of this important Security Council resolutions. Let us use the Idlib window, as Stefan mentioned. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, let me just refer to our well-known position on accountability, on humanitarian assistance, and certainly on the need for a political transition to take place as a precondition for reconstruction aid. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Netherlands for his statement, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Peru. President, we thank you for convening this meeting, and we thank Staffan de Mistura for his important briefing. Peru observes with concern the outlook for a political solution in Syria after the recent meetings held between the Special Envoy and key players, which we were informed of this morning. Just a few days ago, in this council, we felt that the auspicious agreement reached between Turkey and the Russian Federation for the establishment of a demilitarized zone in Idlib paved the way for a more propitious context for achieving the political agreement, allowing us to glimpse sustainable peace in Syria. Now we wish to reaffirm the urgent need to establish a constitutional committee which is inclusive and representative, in accordance with what was agreed upon 9 months ago in the Sochi Congress. We believe that this is an important initiative which, like the Astana process, acts as a complement to the Geneva process. In this regard, with full respect for the sovereignty, unity and territorial integrity of the Syrian Arab Republic, we consider it necessary to urgently convene the Constitutional Committee and to define its working and decision-making mechanisms with a view to advancing the political progress contained within Resolution 2254 and the Geneva Communiqué. We are particularly concerned about the possibility of new delays in beginning the committee's work and the fact that these could affect the credibility of this and result in greater divergences within that process. We stress that the importance of all parties to commit constructively to negotiations, displaying flexibility and looking to the future and to national unity so as to build the necessary trust to promote reconciliation and build sustainable peace in Syria. In the same vein, we wish to express our full support for the Special Envoy of the Secretary-General in his efforts to make progress in this direction. In particular, the way in which he has gone about his discussions and conversations in Damascus and the actions he has explained he will be carrying out over the next few days. Likewise, and by way of conclusion, President, we wish to underscore the importance of the Astana guarantors and other countries with influence over the parties contributing to ensuring that the Constitutional Committee be convened soon, and ideally during this November. Thank you. I thank the distinguished representative of Peru for his statement, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Kazakhstan.
Mr. President, we thank Special Envoy de Mistura for the briefing about the results of his visit to Damascus. Stefan, we appreciate your visit and thank you for all your efforts to achieve peace in Syria. We highly estimate your engagement in intensive further consultations in the period ahead to verify the possibilities for convening a credible and balanced UN-facilitated, Syrian-owned and Syrian-led constitutional committee. Kazakhstan closely follows the situation around the crisis in Syria and supports all initiatives aimed at resolving the violent conflict in the Syrian Arab Republic as soon as possible. We consider the protection of the Syrian people, civilians, and objects as a high priority. At this moment, our attention should be focused on preserving the peace around Idlib. In this regard, I would like to thank Russia and Turkey for the agreement that allowed us to prevent bloodshed and a large-scale humanitarian catastrophe. We are encouraged by information on the establishment of humanitarian corridors that can be used by up to 3,000 civilians. All this is a result of the creation of a demilitarized zone, which has become a guarantee of the cessation of hostilities. We welcome the agreement reached on October 24 in Moscow by the Astana guarantors to speed up the formation of the Constitutional Commission. At the same time, Astana calls upon all interested parties to take into account the interests of all Syrians in the formation of the Constitutional Commission in accordance with the UN Security Council Resolution 2254. We also commend the readiness of the Astana Group to pursue dialogue with so-called the small group on Syria, and we know that the dialogue should be based on that resolution. Kazakhstan underlines the need to move towards the creation of the Constitutional Committee as a starting point for the revitalization of the political settlement process in Syria. We hope that the committee will be formed as soon as possible. At the same time, in the future, the Constitutional Committee should work in compliance with the UN Charter, international law, and UN resolutions on the Syrian issue to protect the sovereignty, independence, and unification of Syria. Astana underlines the importance of achieving a political solution in Syria, especially by forming a constitutional committee as a major step to politically settle the crisis. Astana fully supports the Special Envoy's efforts in achieving a comprehensive settlement for the regional crisis. It is the Syrians themselves who should begin to shape the future political system of the Syrian states with the necessary legislative reforms, its territorial and administrative structure, and presidential and parliamentary elections. Only a political diplomatic approach in the spirit of our charter and the UNSC documents on preventive diplomacy and sustaining peace can bring proper results. There is therefore a strong need to continue supporting the goals of the Astana talks and further Geneva negotiations in order to see positive outcomes. We believe that the Syrian people are capable of determining their own future. However, achieving their aspirations for democracy, reconstruction, and stability is impossible without genuine international support. In conclusion, I would like to emphasize that the Security Council has a special responsibility to end the tragic period in Syria. We urge the Security Council to unite around this common political goal, voice support to the Geneva and Astana processes, as well as to the Special Envoy and a comprehensive political settlement. I thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Kazakhstan for his statement, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Kuwait.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I would like to thank Mr. Staffan de Mistura for his important briefing. The state of Kuwait expresses its appreciation for his efforts over the past 4 years. We are certain that you will carry out your tasks until your last day in office. We have just listened to a briefing on the outcome of your visit to Damascus, a visit that we had hoped would lead to positive results and would move forward the Syrian political process 9 months after the Sochi declaration regarding the Constitutional Committee. Unfortunately, the outcomes of the visit were contrary to our aspirations and hopes. The formation of the Constitutional Committee is an important step in the political process and a basis for further steps in the future, according to Resolution 2254, including the drafting of the Constitution, the holding of free and credible elections in Syria, under the supervision of the United Nations and with the participation of all Syrians. The Sochi Declaration sets clearly the role of the Special Envoy and the Geneva process in the formation of the Constitutional Committee as a way to contribute to the political process under the auspices of the United Nations according to Resolution 2254. There is still 1 month to go until you leave your office, Mr. de Mistura, and we encourage you to continue your efforts to form the Constitutional Committee and to convene its work as soon as possible. And we express our support to you once again. We believe that you have the necessary mandate to create the Constitutional Committee, and we agree with you on the need to create a balanced and credible committee. In closing, Mr. President, we stress the need to respect and implement Security Council resolutions. They should not remain dead letter, especially Resolution 2254, which was unanimously agreed by the Council 3 years ago. We have an opportunity over the next days that we must all seize, especially after the stability in Idlib following the Russian-Turkish agreement. This is an important opportunity to revitalize the political process led by the United Nations following 8 years of war, destruction, death, and displacement in Syria. We hope that diplomatic solutions and not military solutions will prevail. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Kuwait for his statement, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ethiopia.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank Special Envoy Staffan de Mistura for his briefing today. We highly appreciate and support his continued and tireless efforts to facilitate a peaceful solution to the Syrian crisis. While he informed us in his last briefing his plan to move on after November, we have full confidence that he would do everything possible until the last day to help move the political process forward. It is in this context that we welcome his meeting in Damascus with the Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Syria a few days ago. We note that the Special Envoy had, to use his own words, a very frank and very intense exchange of views on the Constitutional Committee and the political process in general. We thank him for sharing with us what transpired during the meeting. We understand the discussion on this issue has not been easy, and finding a common ground would continue to be a challenge. Nevertheless, we believe Special Envoy de Mistura should continue his efforts to convene the Constitutional Committee as soon as he possibly can. We all agree that the agreement reached between Russia and Turkey on Idlib provides a window of opportunity that should be seized to revive a credible, inclusive, and Syrian-owned political process, starting with the establishment of a UN-facilitated Constitutional Committee. We note there was a meeting of the Astana guarantors in Moscow this week, which we hope would be helpful in sustaining engagement to move the political process forward, particularly the formation of the Constitutional Committee. At the same time, we'll also look forward to the Quartet Summit on Syria that would be held in Istanbul this weekend. We hope all these diplomatic initiatives at various levels would contribute to reinvigorating the UN-facilitated political process. As the process of the Constitutional Committee should be Syrian-led and Syrian-owned, we encourage all Syrian parties to constructively engage with the Special Envoy. Finally, this is the time to further coordinate and accelerate diplomatic efforts to support the envoy in his endeavors to establish the Constitutional Committee. This Council should also continue to put its full weight behind the Special Envoy, whose efforts will be extremely critical over the coming days and months. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Ethiopia for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Côte d'Ivoire.
Thank you, Mr. President. My delegation welcomes the convening of this briefing devoted to the establishment of the Constitutional Committee in the Syrian Arab Republic, and would like to thank Mr. Staffan de Mistura, Special Envoy of the Secretary General of the United Nations for Syria, for his instructive briefing. Mr. President, Côte d'Ivoire welcomes the meeting on the 24th of October between the Special Envoy of the Secretary General and the Syrian Foreign Minister, leading to a communiqué with the Office of the Special Envoy reporting a very frank and intense exchange of views on the subject of the Constitutional Committee and the political process in general. In this respect, my country encourages the Syrian parties to choose the path of dialogue by sincerely engaging in the framework of the Geneva and Sochi processes with a view to the effective lifting of the final obstacles to the establishment of the Constitutional Committee. Côte d'Ivoire also welcomes the holding on the 27th of October in Istanbul of the four-way summit between Germany, France, Russia and Turkey, which will be a platform for reflection on the political process to resolve the crisis under UN auspices and the situation in Idlib in the northeast of Syria. Côte d'Ivoire sincerely wants dialogue to continue between all of the stakeholders with a view to ensuring a peaceful solution to the crisis in Syria, which will ensure lasting peace and stability. And this regardless of the conclusions of the talks launched by Staffan de Mistura with the Syrian authorities on the one hand and the summit in Istanbul on the other. As a result, we call upon the parties to the conflict to respect the provisions of Resolution 2254, outlining the roadmap for the political process in Syria, and once again call upon member states of the Security Council to recover the unity that has always allowed them in difficult circumstances to overcome the challenges to international peace and security. Mr. President, as Mr. Staffan de Mistura is preparing to step down, Côte d'Ivoire would like to express its sincere gratitude to him for his sustained commitment and for the work done to restore lasting peace in Syria. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Côte d'Ivoire for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Poland.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, at the outset, let me join other delegations in expressing our deep appreciation for the tireless efforts by the Special Envoy aimed at finding the political solution of crisis in Syria. Allow me also to assure you, the Special Envoy, about Poland's strong support for your continuous work and also for the UN-led political peace process in Syria. Mr. President, as there is no military solution to the conflict that can bring sustainable peace to the Syrians, we should aim at reaching an intra-Syrian framework political agreement. Furthermore, we strongly believe that the Idlib ceasefire agreement could be an opportunity for the resumption as soon as possible of a political process under the UN auspices in Geneva. In this regard, we express our full support for all your efforts, Staffan, to establish a constitutional committee as soon as possible. And as last week we had a number of discussions on women, peace and security here in the chamber, it's worth to recall your appeal, Staffan, on ensuring women's participation in the committee, as there is a clear link between women's participation in peace process and durability and quality of peace agreement. Mr. President, it should be implemented now as a priority, and further steps should swiftly allow to enable a negotiated political transition process. It requires a full and constructive engagement of all the parties to the conflict. A special role has to be played by the Syrian authorities, which should participate in the negotiations in good faith and without preconditions. It is for the Syrians themselves to negotiate. Only a real, tangible political process, which would ensure true representation of the Syrian people, could provide the setting of a timetable and procedures for drafting a constitution and conducting UN-supervised free and fair elections. Let me conclude by underlining that a political solution must be brokered in accordance with the UN Security Council Resolution 2254 and the Geneva Communique. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Poland for his statement, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Equatorial Guinea. Thank you, President. Allow me at the outset to thank the delegations of France, the United Kingdom and the United States for having requested this meeting, and the Special Envoy, Staffan de Mistura, for his informative briefing and his assiduous work facilitating the political process in Syria. The swift organization of this meeting, so soon after last week's meeting on the 17th and the meeting of the 24th in Damascus, attests to the need to start and deploy further efforts to address and resolve the new challenges and implement without delay the work of the Constitutional Committee, so as to open the way towards a political and peaceful solution to this long conflict. President, whilst the Republic of Equatorial Guinea welcomes the exemplary work done by the Special Envoy and the way in which he has exercised his functions in extremely complicated conditions, we cannot but regret the fact that after 8 years of conflict, during which numerous meetings have been held in the Geneva and Astana formats, we are now at a crossroads, as the French delegation so well described it during the last meeting, and as he has mentioned again today. The spectre of a military escalation and the difficult path towards resuming peace negotiations between the Syrian parties are the constant focus of attention for the international community. We welcome the meeting in Damascus between the Special Envoy and the Syrian Foreign Minister on the 24th of this month, as one of the attempts to create the Constitutional Committee, which will be charged with drafting a new constitution for Syria. We recall to the parties that 9 months after the Sochi Agreement to form the committee, it is now time to make significant progress. In this regard, the demilitarization of Idlib, agreed upon by the Astana guarantors, is an opportunity to further boost the political process, creating a favorable climate for intra-Syrian peace negotiations. President, it is important to seize the opportunity of this context of relative peace to offset the difficulties standing in the way of the prompt start of the committee's work. As has been underscored, the main stumbling block remains the composition of the middle third list, civil society, as proposed by the United Nations. We call upon the parties to spare no efforts at establishing a highly credible committee, and this is very important and necessary, which also has the greatest possible representativeness. Likewise, the credibility and legitimacy of the committee requires transparency mechanisms regarding the composition, working methods, and decision-making methods of the committee. It also means that national parties must renounce their partisan interests and that they are on an equal footing so as to ensure the success of the works of the Constitutional Committee. As the Special Envoy has stressed in the past, and again today, a balanced and credible committee could be the cornerstone of an inclusive political process for the Syrians in the implementation of Resolution 2254. It is in this same vein that the government of the Republic of Equatorial Guinea hopes that the summit on Syria to be held tomorrow between the Russian Federation, Turkey, France and Germany will significantly help in promoting a political solution to the crisis, with a priority upon the discussions about starting the committee's work. It is also necessary that further steps be taken to strengthen security and stability and to provide conditions allowing for the return of refugees and the restoration of social and economic infrastructures. President, in Chapter 5 of the Charter of the United Nations, Article 24 confers upon this Security Council the primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. Distinguished members of the Council, let us restore peace and security to Syria. After 8 years of conflict, the situation in Syria must not continue to be a topic which entrenches divisions between members of the Security Council. A sustainable solution in Syria cannot be achieved without the unreserved involvement of those members of this council who are allies of the warring parties or who are able to influence the national parties. The peoples of the world are watching us, and history will judge us. We must display our highest Republican sentiments as members of this council, both permanent and non-permanent, and the humanist values which underpin this organization, and bring an end to this conflict by putting our own geostrategic interests second to the legitimate well-being and prosperity of the Syrian people. We call upon the Syrian government and people to take into account the political context in their country and to support efforts being deployed by the international community so as to allow for an inclusive debate with the various stakeholders involved in this conflict within the framework of the Constitutional Committee and in accordance with Resolution 2254, which was adopted by unanimity in this Security Council upon the proposal of the Russian Federation. I thank you. I thank the distinguished representative of Equatorial Guinea for his statement, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. President. We welcome Special Envoy Staffan de Mistura. Only 10 days ago, Staffan, we heard your briefing in this chamber, and it's hard to recall a practice in which UN mediators publicly briefed the Council about each contact they had with the parties to a given conflict or interested international players. Experience indicates that this source of work requires a great deal of patience, caution, and a very careful dose of public presence so as to not harm the matter at hand, and therefore we are not convinced that those who insisted on convening today's open meeting are really working for peaceful settlement in Syria. Instead of that, as was easy to suppose, there's been another show set up with tragic wails and moralizing against Russia. Now, on the Syrian track, there is clear activity. On the one hand, in the framework of Resolution 2254 of the Security Council, the United Nations is working. The Idlib agreement is being implemented. Our Turkish partners are working seriously on this. The guarantors of the Astana process are taking serious efforts to put an end to violence on the ground and create conditions for progress on the intra-Syrian dialogue track. This is difficult, but concrete achievements are evident. People in many parts of Syria are beginning to return to normal life and feel that they are in greater security. On the other hand, we have this solemnly seated group of self-titled examiners who have not made any noteworthy progress in the aforementioned settlement, but for some reason are trying to indicate what Russia is doing. We repeat that there are no grounds for establishing artificial deadlines for the establishment of the Constitutional Committee on the outcomes of the Sochi dialogue of Syrians. Conditions cannot be opposed that contradict the will of the Syrian parties themselves. Staffan's visit to Damascus upon the invitation of the Syrian government was a useful one on the path towards achieving the goals laid out in Sochi. We are confident that in the time remaining until the end of Staffan's term, he will leave no stone unturned to make progress on this area within his mandate as mediator with full respect for the sovereignty of Syria, and we will help him in doing that. The very fact that the Special Envoy went to Damascus is fundamentally important. But this is not the only thing happening on the track of the Syrian settlement. Recently in Moscow, there were consultations of the Astana Troika. Tomorrow in Istanbul, there will be the four-side summit, Turkey, Russia, Germany and France, in which the Special Envoy will also participate. Incidentally, according to our information and assessments, the visit to Damascus, Staffan's visit to Damascus, was extremely useful and constructive. We should not underestimate its importance and the momentum that this visit can give to the settlement process. At the same time, we warn those who would like to draw dubious dividends from artificially whipping up the crisis that it would be criminal and it would harm the political process. This first and foremost applies to the Western participants in the so-called small group. We are convinced that the UN Secretary-General and his Special Envoy understand the deep responsibility in this delicate matter, and we believe, Staffan, that your briefing today is not your political will, but in the time remaining until the end of your mandate, you can still do a lot. This is not your swan song. And we expect you to continue to work tirelessly on this. And once again, I'll repeat that we will do everything we can to assist you in that. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation for his statement. I will now make a statement as permanent representative of the plurinational state of Bolivia. My delegation should like to thank the Special Envoy for the briefing, Mr. Staffan de Mistura, and we highlight his visit to Damascus and his efforts to achieve a political solution to this conflict. We are convinced that dialogue is the best way of achieving positive results. In this regard, we once again highlight the efforts of the Astana guarantors and the agreements on the city of Idlib, which have shown tangible results to move away from violence and bring relative peace to the people in Syria. We reiterate the fact that this conflict cannot have a military solution. We therefore reject any attempts at fragmentation in the Syrian Arab Republic, as well as any presence of foreign forces without authorization of the Syrian government. Once again, we highlight the tireless work of Mr. de Mistura on this topic, which is so sensitive and important, not only for the Council, but also for the whole of the international community. We express gratitude for all the work done over the years, and we reiterate our full support for his endeavours towards achieving this political solution. We shall await the results of the upcoming meetings, which he will be holding within the context of a high-level diplomacy. Having heard what Mr. de Mistura told the Council, our delegation would like to see the glass half full rather than half empty. We remain optimistic that the patient and dedicated work being done will yield positive results. We agree that if we wish to strengthen the political process, we must also give the Special Envoy the opportunity to work and to focus on achieving positive results. We therefore believe that the solution must allow for continuity and implementation of the final outcome declaration of Sochi, whose main aim is to establish a constitutional committee which is credible and balanced, as well as being representative. All of this in permanent consultation and coordination with the Syrian government. We call for an end to this conflict through an inclusive political dialogue, which is with consultation led for and by the Syrian people. This should allow for a sustainable, peaceful resolution to the situation within the context of the Geneva process, Resolution 2254, and all of this under the auspices of the United Nations within the context of international law and respect for the principle of sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity of the Syrian Arab Republic. I resume my role as President of the Security Council, and I would now like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.
Shukran, Sidi Rais.
Thank you, President. At the outset, President, I should like to say that have a feeling, which I'm sure is shared by other colleagues, that those who convened this meeting are trying to empty cooperation between the Syrian Arab Republic and the United Nations of all sense. This cooperation, as you know, has had a number of positive consequences and results over the years, the so-called crisis years in Syria. I heard a number of colleagues, particularly those who called for the holding of this meeting, saying that the Syrian government did not want to commit to any kind of cooperation with the United Nations. These observations are not underpinned by facts, the facts that you all know. First of all, we are one of the founding countries of the United Nations. We were elected 3 times to the Security Council. We are not, therefore, strangers to the importance of this international organization or your August Council. Secondly, we are committed to the Geneva discussions and have been so since the outset. We have held dozens of meetings with Kofi Annan and since then with Akhtar Brahimi and Staffan de Mistura. We have devoted thousands of hours of work to cooperation with these people in order to help Syria to reach an end of the crisis. Therefore, we are committed with the United Nations. You know that we participated with you 56 times in examining the OCHA reports, the Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. 56 times. These are reports from OCHA, the United Nations humanitarian body. So once again, this attests to our cooperation with the United Nations. We cooperate with all the United Nations bodies in Damascus and 28 international NGOs as well. We have also participated in the Astana process, which had positive outcomes, as you know. We cooperate with the Organization of the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, as you know, and have participated in dozens of meetings on that topic. Therefore, there is no reason to doubt the cooperation of my government with the United Nations. I should no longer like to hear this being said in these important meetings. President, this meeting is being held to hear the briefing from the Special Envoy in Syria, and it is happening 2 days after the anniversary of the creation of our organization. We are proud to have been one of the founding members and signatory members of the Charter. As I have just said, the Charter enshrines the principles of independence, sovereignty, and refusal of the crimes of aggression and interference in internal state affairs, and respect for territorial integrity of states. 70 years after the creation of our organization and the fact that these noble values were enshrined in the Charter, it is shameful for them to be swept aside and ignored by states, including some permanent members of the Council. Very swiftly, some Western countries did indeed violate the Charter. Before the ink it was even written with was dry. An unprecedented terrorist war was waged against my country, a 7-year war, which has seen the creation of a military base to protect and train terrorists from the 4 corners of the globe. We were called the moderate opposition, the armed opposition. The plans and projects of the enemies of Syria are harmful and poisonous, as a snake's venom would be, but in the face of the resilience and determination of our people, they will become as fragile as a spider's web. I regret that the statement by the Special Envoy today did not refer in any way to terrorism and to the bombings carried out by the so-called coalition, which is illegitimate and directed by the United States of America, of Syrian towns and villages for the 69th time. 69 military raids carried out by coalition planes which have led to thousands of martyrs and destroyed my country's infrastructure. The Special Envoy did not see that. Whilst in Geneva, I always started meetings by recalling this, by recalling the need to make a statement condemning these military operations against Syrian civilians, wherever these happened. President, once again, the so-called coalition, the illegitimate coalition led by the United States of America on the 19th of October 2018 carried out an abject crime which caused dozens of civilian deaths, dozens of deaths. Coalition planes targeted the villages of Sosa and Boubadran in the southwest, leading to 62 martyrs, most of them women and children, as well as numerous injuries, some of them critical. I informed the Council through 96 official communications of the abject crimes committed by the illegitimate coalition against Syrian civilians. I demonstrated that the coalition had targeted everything except armed terrorist groups. It is as though our interlocutors, as the poet said, if my interlocutors were alive, my voice would have reached them. Some members of the Council have been passive with regard to these crimes, and the Special Envoy has followed in their wake and did not refer to them. The report of the Secretariat, which claims to be credible, well, it's being far from being so, did not refer to these crimes. We therefore call for accountability and for those states who consider themselves to be defenders of the right to life, move away from this pernicious coalition today, not tomorrow. These states wept over Idlib and claimed to want to protect civilians, but did not wish to see when armed terrorist groups in Idlib targeted civilians in Aleppo with dozens of missiles guided by hatred on the 24th of October, resulting in dozens of injured people and deaths. We have heard no statement with regard to the attack on Aleppo from the Special Envoy or from anybody else within the Council. As you know, Idlib is a dearly held part of my country, and we are determined to recover Idlib. As I have already said, we allow for diplomatic and political work, but our right under the Charter and international law allows us to fully recover Idlib when we deem it necessary. The Syrian Arab Republic government will not allow Idlib to become another case like Tora Bora. We will not allow that. There can be no other Tora Bora terrorist groups as in Idlib. This has already been fully decided upon. President, based on our respect for the role of the United Nations in facilitating intra-Syrian dialogue, the Vice Prime Minister and Foreign Minister for Syria and the diaspora on the 24th of October met the Special Envoy in Damascus. During that meeting, the efforts deployed for moving ahead with the political process to resolve the crisis in Syria were discussed, as were ideas regarding the political process and the committee discussing the constitution. This was discussed between the Minister and the Secretary General Antonio Guterres in New York on the margins of the work of the 73rd General Assembly of the United Nations. My country is firmly convinced of the importance of the United Nations and its charter, as were the founding fathers. This is a role based upon the strength of law and not upon the arrogance of strength or force, a role which acts in full respect of states' sovereignty and non-interference in their internal affairs. A town for terrorist camp must not be established where terrorists could spread and disseminate. And Tanf is part of Syrian territory, as you know. This is a violation of the Charter. Upon that basis, the Syrian government has committed positively and openly to the Geneva negotiations and discussions and transparently allowed for meetings with the Special Envoy since he has been working as intra-Syrian facilitator for the last 4 years. My country continues to wish for the success of this mission because this is in the interest of the Syrian people, as attested to by the Syrian government in having discussions with Mr. de Mistura's predecessors, Kofi Annan and Ahmad al-Brahimi. My country has fully committed to the Astana process and dealt positively with the results of the National Syrian Dialogue in Sochi. My country continues to wish to preserve the results achieved regarding the creation of a committee to discuss the constitution. The special envoy can be the facilitator of the work of this committee. My government was the first to submit a list of participants from the Syrian state to the special envoy and believes that the guarantor countries play an important role in full cooperation and coordination with the Syrian government with regard to the creation of the committee, its mandate, its working mechanisms, with the facilitation of the United Nations. You will note that we do not refuse to involve the United Nations in this. However, the role of the United Nations is one of a facilitator, to facilitate intra-Syrian dialogue. Rather than having guardianship over this dialogue, facilitation. The special envoy is responsible for facilitating dialogue, intra-Syrian dialogue. Finally, President, no one more than the Syrian government wishes to bring an end to this crisis, which has been ravaging my country for over 7 years. We bear the brunt of this terrorist war, essentially, this war which aimed to fragment the state, kill our people, and destroy our infrastructures. That, then, was the plan in making trying to make Syria into a failed state or a bandit state, a failed state. We have also been open to combating terrorism attempts in order to resolve the crisis by resolving its status and their involvement within this war by ensuring national reconciliation to stop the bloodbath and ensure that we have full control of the Syrian territory. We believe that the creation of a constitutional committee reflecting Syrian society and realizing its ambitions is a way of exiting the crisis. The Syrian state also believes that the meeting between the foreign minister and the Secretary General on the margins of the current session of the General Assembly and the consultations recently held with the Special Envoy in Damascus, we believe that these meetings are the beginnings of work which reflect our positive cooperation with the Special Envoy. We are convinced that coordination with the guarantors, Iran and Russia, for studies, solutions should result in the implementation of to discuss the constitution. We must work which can work harmoniously and realize the aspirations of the Syrian people. This all plays an important role in meeting our objectives. In particular, the Sochi Conference on Intra-Syrian Dialogue and is the conference which lay behind the creation of a committee to discuss the constitution. This was the Sochi conference which put forward that idea. It was not the special envoy or the Geneva meetings or the Astana meetings. The Syrians in Sochi decided upon the creation of this committee. We believe that defining artificial deadlines do not serve the desired solution and will not help us to realize our aspirations. Allow me to underscore, President, finally, that the Syrian government will deploy every effort to achieve the aspirations of the Syrian people and of our friends, our true friends, as well as all those who aspire to creating a world free of terrorism and to strengthening the values of the Charter and achieving stability and security in the region and across the world. We are willing to continue cooperation with the United Nations so as to reach the desired solution. I thank you, President. I thank the distinguished representative of the Syrian Arab Republic for his statement. The distinguished representative of the United Kingdom has requested to make a further statement. You have the floor.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. President. I'll be very brief. We've heard a lot of support for the Special Envoy in the Chamber today. Let's look to that to hold between now and the 19th of November. But I did, if I may, have a question about Idlib. The Syrian ambassador referred to the Syrian authorities retaking, I repeat, retaking Idlib. That would cut across the agreement that the Russians and the Turks have made over Idlib. So I would be grateful to know, Mr. President, if the Russian and Turkish agreement on Idlib still holds and for how long it's likely to hold.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom for her statement. The distinguished representative of the Syrian Arab Republic has asked for the floor to make a further statement, and you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I thank the ambassador of the UK for her question on this matter and for requesting more clarification. Many a time, on behalf of my government, and you know this, I said that Idlib is a dear part of our land, Syria. So we're not talking about Florida, we're not talking about Glasgow or Marseille. We're talking about Idlib, a territory that is part of the Syrian Arab Republic. Second, when there is terrorism that threatens any member state of this council, it is natural that the government immediately combats this terrorism. There are many examples. Yesterday, for example, all US media was talking about the terrorist wave and sending the 9 parcels to some figures in New York and other places. And also, TV stations were talking about the seriousness of this terrorist act. Fortunately, this terrorist act did not lead to any loss of lives. We all think that the US administration is right when investigating this matter because it is a terrorist act. Well, what about 30,000 foreign terrorists in Idlib? 30,000. All of them, of course, are moderate. Al-Nusra, Daesh, Al-Furqan, and others. All of them are very moderate. 30,000 foreign terrorists that bombarded Aleppo 2 days ago. They killed scores and injured dozens. They bombarded Idlib or Aleppo from Idlib. So this is a violation or a breach of the Iranian or of the Russian-Turkish agreement. So this is the breach. it's not about our intention to retake Idlib, that is controlled by terrorists right now. Of course, we will retake Idlib, and I said we will restore our sovereignty over Idlib when the government deems it appropriate to do that. What does this mean? This means that when we are sure that diplomatic and political efforts have failed to restore this dear part of our territory to national sovereignty. So this is governed by diplomatic and political formula. So we know how to deal with this matter, and naturally we have friends and allies who are with us in this reading and understanding. So it's not surprising to say on behalf of my government that we will retake sovereignty or restore sovereignty over Idlib because it's part of our territory in the time that we deem appropriate. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Syrian Arab Republic for his statement. The distinguished representative of the Russian Federation has requested the floor for a further statement.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll be just as brief as my distinguished British colleague who asked her question very briefly. It was a very specific question about whether the Russo-Turkish Idlib agreement is in effect. And yes, it is being implemented. It continues to be observed, which we said in our statement. At the same time, I would like to confirm what was said by the distinguished representative of the Syrian Arab Republic, that we are talking about a territory which is part of sovereign Syria. And it goes without saying that we believe that ultimately the legitimate Syrian authorities will acquire control over all of their territory, which makes up the territory of the Syrian Arab Republic. There are no contradictions between the first and the second. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Russia for his statement. I don't know whether Mr. de Mistura would like to say anything further. Yes, you have the floor. Stefan.
Signor Presidente. First of all,
thank you, President.
To clarify one point, if you allow me. When I had this very intense and long meeting with Minister Moallem, he did not raise the issue of terrorism. That's why I did not refer. This meeting we have today specifically about my visit to Damascus, and specifically in Damascus the issue was Constitutional Committee, just to put it on record. Now, what is up now in front of us, just to remind, how would I say, the challenge, but also the time we are having. This is a very special month, not because I'm leaving, but because it is actually a very special month in November. We're having tomorrow the Istanbul summit. We're having a meeting, certainly, of the Astana Group, and as you know, we're all looking forward to see whether the Astana Group will be able, as we hope, to come up with some type of proposal to be ascertained by the UN, and hopefully look at it as if, and hopefully would be credible and inclusive. So it is quite a task. Thirdly, we're having probably very much more than one meeting of the small group taking place, one on Monday. There is a summit we heard between President Putin and President Trump taking place in November, and we're having at least one Security Council meeting on the 19th. A lot of opportunities to actually push for obtaining some movement on the Constitutional Committee. So what will I be doing during this period? Well, push, as you rightly said and asked me to, and see whether what will be happening, especially on the Astana Group, because there is a task which has been given to them, and they're giving to themselves in November. Continue ascertaining the feasibility of the follow-up to the Sochi Declaration and of the Constitutional Committee in order to report accordingly to the Security Council and to the Secretary General. Leave no stone unturned until the last day of my own assignment in order to take any opportunity for issuing invitation for a first meeting of the Constitutional Committee. And then, in any way, assess the outcome of all these discussions and meetings in order to brief the Secretary General and the Security Council about what is the clarity about the Constitutional Committee and why things are moving or why they are not moving. You deserve to have that all in November, and I have the duty to clarify that to you. Thank you.
Mistura.
I thank Mr. de Mistura. There are no further names inscribed on the list. The meeting is adjourned.